Hello, everyone. I am Majestika Kahuna, and tonight we're going to be talking about Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California. I would like to start off with this quote by Judge Tobriner, who was on the board of the Tarasoff case. Protective privilege ends where the public peril begins. Before we move on to the content of the case, this is just going to be a general overview of what we're going to be covering. We are going to touch on some background information, such as a summary video that talks about the varying opinions that have emerged since the Tarasoff case. From there, we can look at the events leading to Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California. Prosenjit Potter's trial, what the trial of Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California enacted, and how this trial shaped the history of psychology forever. The video that we're going to be watching is called Should Medical Privacy Laws Be Changed? It gives us a brief description of what happens when psychologists or psychiatrists fail to protect the public from dangerous individuals and some of the negative implications that come with exercising their right to do so.
After this tragedy, we wondered whether psychiatrists in America are required to tell the authorities about patients with troubled minds who have the lives of the public in their hands. Jeff Pegues is looking into this.
What you say to your doctor is usually confidential, but 45 states have laws requiring or permitting mental health professionals to disclose if they believe a patient is dangerous. Dr. Robert Klitzman is a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University.
There's legal and there's ethics. So legally, right now, I am under no obligation as a physician to tell anyone. Ethically, however, I would argue that if I'm a physician and I know someone may have a plane full of people and crash it, I feel that there may be times when I have an obligation to notify someone.
A case 40 years ago shows the danger of a doctor keeping quiet. In 1969, California college student Prosenjit Padar killed a woman he'd met in a dance class. Before the murder, Padar told his therapist about his desire to kill Tatiana Tarasoff. The therapist didn't warn the victim.
And a court found that he was liable, that in that case he should have violated patient confidentiality. So there's an ethical standard on the one hand and a legal standard on the other.
But even reporting is not foolproof. In 2012, after James Holmes shot and killed 12 people in an Aurora, Colorado movie theater, the investigation revealed his psychiatrist had warned police that he was dangerous and homicidal, but it's not clear if anything was done. Some privacy advocates agree that there are cases where warning law enforcement is necessary, but they worry about a chilling effect on patients. Chad Marlowe is with the American Civil Liberties Union.
You might deter people from seeking mental health services in order to avoid disclosing things they want to keep private.
Moving on, who was involved? Well, we're going to be looking at three particular people that were regularly targeted in the Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California. The first person that we'll be talking about is Tatiana Tanya Tarasoff. She was a 19-year-old graduate student that attended the University of California, Berkeley. As for her character, she was seen as a rather promiscuous person by her peers, especially for being in multiple relationships with various men. It can be inferred that because she refused to be in a committed relationship, it led to her murder. Next, there is Prosenjit Potter. He was a 22-year-old male that also attended the University of California, Berkeley. He was an international student from Bengal, India, and he stayed in the International House located on campus. In terms of his character, he was always considered quite disturbed by many of his peers. He would be known as the primary offender resulting in the death of Tatiana Tarasoff. Finally, we have Podar's outpatient psychologist, Dr. Lawrence Moore. He was only 34 years old at the time of the incident. He oversaw Podar's care as a University of California staff psychologist. In terms of his character, he appeared to be doing what he thought was best in offering his patients the best services that he could provide for their mental health. However, there are many shortcomings that he faced in the process. Dr. Moore has since passed away in 2013. So what are the events that were leading to Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California? Tarasov and Potter had met in 1968 at the University of California. The international house that Potter was staying at was hosting a folk dancing class that everyone was free to attend. Tarasov had decided to sign up for these classes, and that is where they had first made contact with each other. Tarasov and Potter subsequently entered a relationship together. However, according to Tarasov, it was not exclusive and made it clear to Podar that she was in other relationships with various men. Podar had not taken this seriously at the time. When New Year's Eve came around, these two shared an intimate kiss together. Podar was then head over heels for Tarasov and thought that this kiss would solidify the seriousness of their relationship. Tarasov reminded him of her other romantic partners and proceeded to turn down any of his further advancements. This is where we see Podar seek therapy. After learning about this, Podar became severely depressed over Tarasov's rejection, so much so that with every encounter with her, he would record their conversations so that he could analyze her choice of wording and tone to decipher why she didn't reciprocate the love that he had for her. A close friend of Podar recommended that he seek therapy for his depression. This is where he met Dr. Gold, a psychiatrist that also found him quite disturbing. Dr. Gold had actually diagnosed Podar with schizophrenia and prescribed him medication. Additionally, he wanted Podar to receive weekly psychotherapy from Dr. Moore. At this point in time, Tarasov was away on vacation in Brazil as he was seeking his treatments. During her time away, this is where we learn about Podar's obsessions. Podar began telling Dr. Moore about his love interest without disclosing that it was Tarasov. He had claimed that this woman had disrespected his honor and that he must enact revenge on her. He had fantasized about killing this unnamed woman for some time, often thinking about purchasing weapons to do so. This eventually led to him purchasing a pellet gun in the San Francisco area. After about 8 sessions with Dr. Moore, he had actually found out who Podar's target was through subtle context clues in his stories. This is where Dr. Moore has determined that Podar was a danger to others. At this point, he wanted to place him in involuntary commitment. After Dr. Moore has confirmed with Dr. Gold and the assistant director Dr. Yandels that involuntary commitment was the next best step for Podar, they had to contact campus security or law enforcement to withhold him. After Podar was detained by campus security, they deemed that he appeared to be a rational person and should not have to be committed into a mental facility. Podar had stopped seeking therapy at this point and was later released. After some time away, Tarasov returned to the University of California from her vacation. It had appeared that Podar acted normally in the public eye in Tarasov's absence. Upon her return, he actively tried to pursue her once more, to which she declined. This resulted in Podar showing up at her home without her knowledge along with his weapons. This causes her to panic and run outside. This is where he shoots her with the pellet gun that he had purchased, and then he proceeds to stab her with a kitchen knife 17 times. So what happened to Podar after that? I'll go over this section briefly. Podar was initially persecuted for first-degree murder. However, that was later changed to second-degree murder on the count that he was diagnosed as a schizoid, or someone with an antisocial personality trait. According to the article, Tarasov and the Duty to Protect, eventually the court decided to send Podar back to his home country, and he would never be tried so long as he never returned to the United States again. The murder of Tarasov is what ignited the Tarasov versus the Regents of the University of California. So now that we know the events that led to this court decision, what exactly is it? Tarasov's parents had taken it upon themselves to sue the Regents of the University of California for the failure of notifying them of Podar's threat to their daughter, specifically on the grounds that Dr. Moore failed to comply with the duty to warn third-party members of the potential dangerousness of another individual, the failure of the campus security in detaining and admitting Podar to the mental health facility, and failure to hospitalize him. This civil suit was dismissed by the district court solely based on the fact that there was an absence of the Duty to Warn Act. This meant that Dr. Moore or the Regents of the University of California had no legal obligation to breach patient psychologist confidentiality to potentially preserve the life of another person. The Tarasov family attempted to appeal their civil suit 2 more times, each resulting in the defendants not being found liable for the death of Tatiana. Eventually, the case made its way up to the California Supreme Court. This is where Tarasoff 1, or the duty to warn, was born. This meant that the medical professionals had the duty to warn third-party personnel of the potential of being targeted or threatened by another individual seeking mental help. As a result of this statute, Moore was fired from his occupation as a University of California clinical psychologist. Prior to Tarasoff 1, it was considered necessary for mental health professionals to only notify law enforcement for the dangerousness of an individual. Third-party personnel were excluded. Now that Tarasoff 1 has been enacted in the state of California, does that mean that psychologists and psychiatrists can continue practicing as they normally would, with the exception that they must notify an individual of a potential threat? No. There are many indifferences that were imposed after the passing of Tarasoff 1. This would mean that psychologists had an obligation to breach patient confidentiality without being properly equipped to predict the violent acts of their patients. This would mean that psychotherapists may subsequently violate their contract and lose their license for warning an individual of potential harm to them. In addition to that, one of the main issues that appeared in the video earlier is that people are going to be less willing to seek psychological treatment. This is paired with the failure to trust mental health professionals with their information if psychologists or psychiatrists have the potential to break their confidentiality without the patient's consent. As a result, the American Psychiatric Association and several other organizations decided to challenge the court's decision by filing an amicus curiae. Moving forward, the courts dismissed and reformed Tarasoff 1. Rather than following the guidelines for the duty to warn, Tarasoff 1 had been reformed to Tarasoff 2, the duty to protect. In other words, the duty to warn was no longer valid. Instead, it was much more important for medical professionals, psychologists, or psychiatrists to protect a potential victim. This means that clinicians now have the duty to reasonably protect third parties based on their patients' confidential statements. Or simply put, psychotherapists are allowed to breach patient confidentiality under the condition that their patient may perpetrate violence against another person. So that takes us to what happened as a result of Tarasoff 2. Tarasoff versus the Regents of the University of California basically changed the course of psychology. Prior to the case, there was no standard that would otherwise seek to protect a potential victim in the state of California or elsewhere. However, since the 1976 implementation of Tarasoff 2, many other states have begun inducting their own rules regarding this matter. In simple terms, Tarasoff was enacted on a state-to-state basis. In these cases, clinical psychologists must have a thorough understanding of their state's rules and regulations regarding Tarasoff 2. Other states have been known to narrow the expectations of clinical psychologists, or they have been known to broaden the scope of them. Some states like Maine, North Dakota, and even Nevada, yikes, don't appear to have Tarasoff accounted for. Never before did psychotherapists have this responsibility to notify another person of being potentially harmed. This being coupled with the duty to protect meant that there are many expectations that must be upheld for the foreseeable future in this field of practice. This basically meant that they must learn to exercise non-negligent behavior when patients disclose their fantasies of violence. This includes clinicians learning to foresee the peril that the individual may inflict on others, being able to identify the victims based on a moment's reflection, and fulfilling the standards of reasonable care, such as reaching out to the appropriate authorities. Failure to acknowledge and report such findings can result in negligence on behalf of the psychotherapist. This can be seen as medical malpractice and result in liability issues. Finally, there is a misconception or two that I would like to address with the knowledge that I have gained. Many of the sources that I have found accuse Moore of being negligent, as if he did nothing to actively prevent or deter Podar from committing the murder. Dr. Moore wanted to involuntarily commit Podar, called the appropriate authorities such as campus police, and tried to admit him into a hospital. However, going back to the video that we watched earlier on in the presentation, a person by the name of James Holmes had exhibited homicidal tendencies. He thereby admitted these tendencies to his therapist. As a result, the therapist then took it to law enforcement. Regardless of the fact that law enforcement was notified of Holmes' violent tendencies, Holmes went on to shoot and kill 12 people at the local movie theater back in 2012. Clearly, there is some form of disconnect between law enforcement and the institutionalization of the perpetrators. Regardless if a psychotherapist were to take the necessary steps and reporting the individual that might commit a harmful act, actually detaining them becomes the issue. This has resulted in me looking at more recent articles on the topic of TerraSoft. In the research article, a 20-year follow-up survey of police officers' experience with the TerraSoft warnings, how law enforcement reacts to clinicians' duty to protect, they have found that law enforcement officers are aware of the elements that are composed of the TerraSoft case. However, they are not aware of the policies that come with handling a warning call from clinicians about a violent patient. Rarely is it mentioned that law enforcement officers are also being held just as accountable for not detaining and institutionalizing dangerous people. The process of TerraSoft versus the Regents of the University of California has primarily focused on the roles of the psychiatrist and psychologist. I suppose my final thoughts on this topic consist of considering that reporting might not be enough to deter potential perpetrators. How exactly shall clinicians work with law enforcement to ensure that when they report a dangerous individual, that they'll actually be detained? In the example with Dr. Moore, campus security determined that Podar did not need to be admitted because he appeared to be rational. Campus security determined that for themselves, which is far beyond their scope of practice. Thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation. I also want to say that I hope you guys don't have any haters out there currently seeking therapy, because you already know that Nevada has no obligation to tell you if they're coming for you. And these are my resources.